So I recently refurbed this Cannondale Quick 2 bicycle, and it's really been a joy to ride, but I'm looking at making maybe one more tweak to it. So bicycles, of course, come in different sizes. So back in the day when the top tubes of bicycles were horizontal, they were usually measured by the length of the seat tube in either inches or centimeters, like a 21 or 23 inch frame or a 56 or a 58 centimeter frame. So that's not as relevant today with the geometry of bikes being as it is. So they usually come in sizes like small, medium, large, extra large, which makes sense. But the size of the bike is not simply determined by the length of the seat tube. So certainly there's adjustments you can make to make the bike fit better, such as raising or lowering the seat post. So you see I have the seat post of this up fairly high, but still within its range of adjustment. So that's okay, but as you change the size of a bicycle frame, you sort of blow everything up at the same time, particularly the length of the top tube, which affects the reach from you, the rider, to the handlebars. So you want all of those things to be comfortable. So this bicycle is a medium frame. So I have other medium frame Cannondales and ride them comfortably, but if I was looking at buying this bicycle new, which of course I didn't, I'd probably look at a large too and see which one fit me better. Since I don't have that option, I'm going to try to make a tweak, which is adjusting the size of the stem. So for comparison's sake, this is what a longer stem would look like on this bicycle. So the stems are usually measured in centimeters from the center of the bolt here to the center of the clamp. And this one is 2 to 3, probably 3 centimeters longer than the one that's on the bike. Now this is just something I had lying around, and when you're trying this out, you might want to go with a smaller increment. This is all I have right now. This is what I'm going to try. So in a moment, we'll go back in time and see how to remove the stem from the bicycle, but let's see why we're going to do this at all. So stems essentially have two different measurements. The one is the length of the stem, and the other is the angle of the stem. So you can get stems, of course, that vary in both of those. So this other stem that I have is essentially the same angle as this one. But if we put them side by side, right, they're flush here, you can see that not only does the longer stem give me more reach, but because it's continuing at that angle for longer, that's just geometry. It's also going to be a little bit higher, so that's going to make me a little bit more stretched out on the bike, as well as sit a little bit more upright. And for a bike like this, that might be desirable. So when choosing a new stem, you have to make sure that it will fit both you and the bicycle. So with threadless stems, earlier on, there were two standards. There was a 1-inch that was sort of a retrofit to older bikes with a 1-inch steerer tube. Of course, you'd have to replace the fork with a threadless fork, but this isn't really in use anymore. So for most bikes that people ride, road and mountain, the standard is 1 1/8 inch, which it is for this bicycle. So the stack height, which is in this distance right here, is going to vary from stem to stem, and of course you have to get it right, and it can be adjusted with spacers within reason. Now this is a very important consideration, is the handlebar clamp diameter, and there's basically 3 standards here. So for years the standard was 25.4 millimeters, which is of course 1 inch, and older road and mountain bikes, including American and British made ones, would have handlebars of that diameter. Other European bikes like French or Italian, 26 millimeters was the standard for a road stem. So this is a 25.4, as you can see, and this is a 26 road stem, okay? But more recently, the standard has been what they call oversized, which is 31.8 millimeters, and that's true for both road and mountain bikes, and essentially the stems are interchangeable. Of course, also the length or reach varies, so you can see those differences between these stems here, and of course the angle. So when you're removing the stem, there's 3 sets of bolts to look at. So first are the ones that hold the handlebar to the stem. So those are easy to just take out. But then we have these here. So the bolts that actually hold the stem onto the steer tube of the bicycle are this one and this one. They're clamping it here. So this one has to be removed as well, but what this bolt does is it adjusts the load on the bearings. So it's pulling the stem down and pulling the steer tube up and clamping them together to put the right amount of pressure on the bearings. So we need to take this off too, but we need to loosen these first to unclamp this. So I've undone the bolts holding the handlebar on, so I'm ready to remove the stem now, but you'll notice I'm doing it with the bicycle on the ground rather than on my work stand. The reason is that when the stem is removed, if the front wheel was off the ground, the fork would just fall right out of the steer tube. Bearings could go everywhere and be a big mess. So to keep everything else the same, I'm not going to mess with the bearings this time. Have the bike on the ground, I'm going to loosen these two bolts here. So with those two bolts loosened, the stem is not clamped down tightly, but still not going to come off until I remove the top cap. We've got the top cap off, and now the stem will come off. But let's check something first. Okay, so you can see how the stem works here. So this top cap rests on this edge right here, but does not actually touch the steer tube, which is down here. So here is a threaded nut, a star nut they call it, and this screws into there, and again that is pulling the steer tube up and pushing the stem down to set the pressure on the bearings. But to make it work, you have to have a gap between the top edge of the stem and the top edge of the steer tube. So if we measure that with a micrometer, we'll see that gap is about 5 millimeters. So if we were installing a different stem, well, we are installing a different stem, but we're installing a stem that is of a different height, we'd need to leave a gap there to allow that adjustment to take place. And with all the bolts nice and loose, this should just slide right up, and it does. So we're not going to touch anything else. We're going to leave it as is. These are both Cannondale branded stems, so if I measure this is about 40.3 millimeters, and this one is about almost exactly the same. So that really shouldn't be an issue. However, if you're using a different brand, you might need to change the number or thickness of the spacers here. Again, the point being to maintain that gap between the top edge of the stem and the steer tube. So to reassemble, I'm simply going to slide this back down over the steer tube. See, I've got that nice gap there. I'm going to tighten the bolts only loosely before checking the adjustment. So before we tighten everything up, we need to adjust it. So again, these bolts are what actually hold it on, but this one is what adjusts the pressure on the bearings. So since the pressure on the bearings was pretty good before the headset turned easily, I'm going to tighten this down, and not real tight. I'm not going to crush it, just sort of get it about snug to the way that it was before. Okay, so then I can't test the bearings yet because I need to tighten these somewhat, because if I turn it to test it, it'll move around and change the adjustment. So I need to tighten these down somewhat and then look for play. Okay, so I've tightened up the bolts somewhat so I can check the adjustment. So I'm going to lift the bike off the ground and steer it back and forth, and that feels nice and smooth, so that's good. So the other thing you should do is you certainly do not want this to be moving like this. It's going to make a clinking sound, but even more importantly than that, it's going to wear your components, and it's bad. Don't do that. So if you have a choice between too tight and too loose, a little bit too tighter is better than loose. So to check this, I'm going to apply the front brake and then move the bike back and forth. And I can feel, maybe you can even see there's a little bit of movement, a little bit of clunking. So to deal with that, I'm going to once again loosen these two bolts that's going to then allow the stem to move, and then tighten this one some more, and then retighten them and check it again. So I loosen these 2 bolts, tighten this one about 1/4 to 1/3 of a turn, tighten them back up. Still feels nice and smooth, but no clunking when I apply the brake, so that's great. So the one more thing you need to do before you put it all back together is you need to make sure the stem is at the right angle to the wheel, of course straight on. So you can do that by eye. The best thing to do is to sit on the bike, eyeball it down, make sure the wheel is in line with the frame and the stem is in line with the wheel. Then you can go and tighten everything up. So since what is holding all this together essentially is 2 clamps, you want to make sure that the bolts are not going to come undone while you're riding to avoid, well, something pretty terrible. So this is so important that many stems actually mark the stem with the correct tightness. So on the top of this it says 40 to 50 inch-pounds. On the bottom, you can't see it, it says 4.5 to 5.5 Newton meters. So I have this special bicycle torque wrench from Park, which I've set to 5 Newton meters, which is right in the middle, obviously. So I'm going to tighten these up in a crosswise fashion until it clicks like that. So for these bolts, the correct tightness is between 8 to 10 Newton meters. So that little torque wrench does not have the range to do that. So I have to use a conventional one here and do the same thing. And that was actually quite a bit tighter than I would have done it by hand, so again, doing this with a torque wrench is a really good idea. So one more adjustment you can do is actually the rotation of the handlebars in the stem. So the handlebars are not a straight, a rod or something like that. They have some shape to them. So as you turn it, it's eccentric, and it's going to subtly sort of increase or decrease both the height of it and a little bit of the reach. So the right answer is probably the way it was before you took it apart, which is basically what I did with this, but this is something that's done according to your own preference. Then of course you might have to change the angle of the grips and the levers if you make a significant change to get all that right. So I've taken it out on a test ride and it definitely feels different, but I'm not sure it feels different in a good way. So of course one of the goals was to be a little bit more stretched out on the bicycle, this being on the smaller end of a frame size that would fit me, and it certainly accomplished that, but I think it might be a little bit too much. So a stem with a length in between the one that was on it and the one I put on it might be better. So I'm going to ride it for a while. Don't be too quick to judge. What's been changed can always be changed again or changed back, but this is an important consideration when trying to get your bike to fit you properly.